There is a kind of stillness that belongs only to very old places. It settles into the ground the way frost settles on a winter morning slowly, without announcement, spreading softly across everything it touches. The land that would one day be called the United States of America is one of those old places. It has been holding its stillness for a very long time, longer than any written record can reach, longer than most things we have words for. And when we sit quietly and try to imagine it as it once was, before roads and fences and names carved into stone, what comes to mind is not noise or movement, but a kind of deep, breathing quiet. Forests thick with shadow and the smell of damp earth. Rivers moving slowly under wide, pale skies. Grassland stretching so far in every direction that the horizon seemed to drift further away the longer you walked toward it. This was the world as it existed for many thousands of years, long before the arrival of anyone who kept written records, long before anyone thought to draw a map. The story of the United States does not begin with ships or charters or flags planted in soft sand. It begins much earlier than that, in the slow drift of human movement across an ancient and largely frozen world. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, perhaps even further back than that, the first human beings made their way onto the North American continent. They came, it is believed, from the direction of what is now northeastern Asia, crossing a wide corridor of land that existed during a time when so much of the world's water was locked inside enormous glaciers that the sea level itself was significantly lower than it is today. This corridor, which geologists and historians call Beringia, was not a narrow bridge but a broad, open landscape, cold and windswept and covered with grasses and low-lying plants, wide enough to sustain whole communities of large animals and the people who followed them. These earliest travelers did not know they were crossing between continents. They had no word for continent, no sense of themselves as pioneers or explorers in the way we might imagine such things. They were simply following food, following warmth, following the same slow rhythms that had guided human beings since the very beginning of human time. They moved gradually, generation by generation, not rushing anywhere in particular but drifting forward the way water drifts downhill, finding the easiest path, settling in places that offered shelter and sustenance, moving on when the seasons or the animals or something quieter and harder to name called them further along. It would have taken many, many generations to make any significant southward progress. Children would have been born, grown old, and died without having traveled more than a few dozen miles from where they first drew breath. And yet, over thousands of years, human beings spread slowly across the entirety of the North American continent, and eventually into South America as well, filling the land with their quiet, unhurried presence. The landscape they moved through was not the landscape we would recognize today. The great glaciers of the last ice age still lay heavy across much of the northern part of the continent, walls of ice so enormous and so slow-moving that they seemed less like ice and more like mountains, blue-white and ancient and cold in a way that reached deep into the bones. South of the ice, however, the world was alive in ways that are difficult to imagine now. There were forests of a kind that no longer exist, filled with trees whose species have long since shifted or disappeared. There were animals of a size and variety that the modern world can only glimpse in fossils and careful reconstructions. Woolly mammoths moved through the tall grass of the interior plains, their shaggy coats thick against the cold, their great curved tusks sweeping through the snow as they searched for food beneath. Mastodons browsed in the shadowy forests of the east. Giant ground sloths, creatures as large as modern elephants, moved slowly through the vegetation of the south and southwest. Horses and camels roamed the grasslands, though these were not the horses and camels that would come later with European settlers but ancient North American species, long since gone. Saber-toothed cats rested in the dappled light beneath enormous trees. The world was full and strange, and very, very quiet in the way that only truly wild places can be quiet. The people who moved through this world left behind them only the faintest traces. A stone tool here, shaped with careful, patient hands, its edges still precise after thousands of years buried in the earth. A hearth there, a circle of charred stones where a fire once burned against the dark, where people sat close together against the cold and perhaps told stories in low voices, or simply sat in companionable silence, watching the flames. Bones of animals, cracked open for the marrow inside, discarded and eventually absorbed into the layers of soil and time. These fragments are small and quiet, but they are enough, when gathered together with patience and care, to tell us something of the lives of those earliest people, enough to suggest that they were skilled, adaptable, thoughtful, that they understood the land they moved through with an intimacy that most of us today can barely imagine. As the millennia drifted by and the great glaciers slowly, almost imperceptibly retreated northward, the climate of North America began to shift in gradual ways. The land warmed. Forests changed their shapes and compositions. The great animals of the Ice Age, one by one, grew fewer and finally disappeared entirely, a loss so slow it would have been nearly invisible to any single generation, but devastating across the longer sweep of time. Whether these extinctions were caused primarily by the changing climate, by the pressures of human hunting, or by some quiet combination of the two, is a question that researchers and historians are still gently exploring. What matters, for our purposes, is simply that the world was changing, and the people living in it were changing with it, adapting their ways of finding food and shelter and meaning as the landscape around them gradually transformed. By around 10,000 years ago, the ice had largely retreated to where it remains today in the far north, and the continent had begun to settle into something more like its modern form. And across this transformed landscape, human cultures were slowly, quietly taking root. Different groups of people, separated by mountains and rivers and vast distances, began to develop their own distinct ways of living, their own languages, their own relationships with the land around them. This process was gradual, unhurried, built from the accumulation of small discoveries and adaptations over many generations. It is not something that can be pointed to and dated. It simply happened the way seasons happen, the way rivers carve their channels, slowly and without announcement. In the desert Southwest, people began to discover that certain plants could be cultivated, encouraged to grow in ways that made them more reliable sources of food. This knowledge, which had drifted northward from the civilizations of Mesoamerica over many centuries, transformed the lives of those who received it. Maize, which we call corn, was perhaps the most important of these cultivated plants, a grass that had been carefully shaped through generations of selective planting into something rich and nourishing and dependable in a way that wild plants rarely were. The arrival of maize cultivation in what is now the American Southwest happened slowly, over centuries, spreading from group to group the way all important knowledge spreads, gradually, through contact and exchange and patient experimentation. And with it came the possibility of a more settled way of life, of villages rather than constant movement, of granaries and planning, and the kind of long-term thinking that is only possible when you know where your food is going to come from. The people we call the ancestral Pueblones, though they had many names for themselves that we will never fully recover, built their homes and communities in the canyon lands of what is now the American Southwest in ways that still leave traces visible today. They constructed their dwellings from stone and adobe, shaping each room with careful hands, fitting stones together with a patience that seems almost meditative from this distance. Their villages grew gradually over generations, rooms added to rooms, levels added to levels, until some communities occupied the sides of great cliffs, nestled into natural alcoves in the rock face hundreds of feet above the canyon floor. From below, these cliff dwellings would have seemed to grow from the stone itself, as though the canyon walls had quietly organized themselves into something habitable. Inside, there would have been the smell of wood smoke and dried corn, the low sound of voices, the soft footfall of bare feet on stone floors worn smooth by generations of use. Outside, the vast desert silence, broken only by the distant call of birds and the slow movement of wind through the canyon. These communities flourished for centuries, building elaborate networks of roads and trading relationships, developing rich ceremonial traditions that connected them to the cycles of the seasons and the movements of the sky. Their kivas, circular chambers set partially below ground level, were places of gathering and ceremony, the walls painted with images whose meaning we can only partially guess at now. The people sat in them around low fires, breathing the warm, smoky air, and whatever they did there in those underground rooms was important enough to be done again and again, generation after generation. And then, around the 13th century, these communities were gradually abandoned. People left, drifting away over time toward new settlements, for reasons that may have included drought, soil depletion, or shifts in social organization. Their descendants are the Pueblo peoples of today, still living in the Southwest, still carrying within their cultures the long memory of everything that came before. In the eastern half of the continent, a different kind of quiet culture was taking shape along the great river valleys. The Mississippi River and its many tributaries created a world of remarkable fertility and abundance, with rich bottomland soil perfect for growing crops and forests full of game and waterways full of fish. The people who lived in this region, in the centuries before European contact, built one of the most elaborate cultural systems north of Mexico, a world of earthen mounds and long-distance trade networks and complex social hierarchies that researchers have come to call the Mississippian culture, though that name covers many distinct peoples spread across a vast geography. At the height of this world, a great city existed near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, in what is now the state of Illinois, just east of the modern city of St. Louis. We call it Cahokia, though we do not know what its inhabitants called it. At its peak, sometime around the year 1100, Cahokia may have been home to as many as 20,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time, larger than London, roughly comparable to Paris, a fact that settles into the mind slowly, like something being absorbed rather than learned. The city was centered on a massive earthen platform, a structure so large that it covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza, built by hand over many generations with baskets of soil carried one at a time and packed carefully into place. Atop this mound stood the residence of the city's ruler, visible from miles away, the axis around which an entire world organized itself. Cahokia was surrounded by dozens of smaller mounds of various shapes and purposes, arranged with a deliberateness that suggests careful planning. There were plazas of packed earth where large gatherings took place. There were wooden palisade walls enclosing the central ceremonial district. There were neighborhoods of thatched roof houses arranged in organized patterns. And there was trade, a vast, slow-moving web of exchange that connected Cahokia to communities hundreds and even thousands of miles away, bringing copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians, all of it moving slowly along the river highways of the interior, carrying with it not just goods but ideas and stories and ways of seeing the world. Cahokia, too, was eventually abandoned, its great mounds slowly subsiding back into the landscape over the centuries, the city's people dispersing, the reasons for the abandonment gradually buried under time. What remains now is quiet, a grassy park on the edge of a modern highway, the great mound still rising from the flat Illinois plain, patient and enormous and old, holding its silence the way old things do. Across the continent, in forests and plains and deserts and river valleys, hundreds of distinct peoples and cultures lived their lives in ways shaped by the particular places they inhabited. In the Pacific Northwest, where the forests grew tall and dense, and the rivers ran thick with salmon each autumn, people such as the Chinook and the Tlingit and the Haida built elaborate wooden longhouses and developed intricate ceremonial traditions centered on the concept of wealth and its redistribution. Their totem poles, carved from great cedar trees with tools of stone and bone and antler, rose beside their houses like wooden stories, each carved figure representing a connection to ancestors and spirits and the long history of a particular family. The smell of cedar was everywhere in those communities, a cool, resinous smell that settled into clothing and hair and memory. On the Great Plains, the vast grasslands at the center of the continent, peoples had long lived in ways adapted to following the enormous herds of bison that moved across the landscape in numbers that are difficult to imagine now. Before the arrival of horses in the 16th and 17th centuries, bison hunting was accomplished on foot, a patient, collaborative process involving whole communities working together to drive herds toward cliffs or enclosures where animals could be taken in large numbers. The meat was dried and stored, the hides tanned and shaped into clothing and shelter, the bones and sinew made into tools. Nothing was wasted. The relationship between the plains peoples and the bison was one of the most intimate and complete in the human world, a relationship of total dependence and careful, respectful use that had been refined over thousands of years. In the Northeast, the peoples who would one day be encountered by European explorers and settlers lived in a world of dense forest and clear rivers, of long winters and brief, abundant summers. The Haudenosaunee, known to Europeans as the Iroquois, had developed by perhaps the 15th century a remarkable political structure called the Confederacy, a league of originally 5 nations: the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, Oneida, and Seneca, who had agreed to resolve their disputes through deliberation and consensus rather than warfare. The founding of this confederacy is attributed in Haudenosaunee tradition to 2 figures, the peacemaker and Hiawatha, who traveled from nation to nation speaking of peace and the possibility of unity. The details of this founding drift somewhere between history and sacred story, as the details of all very old and important events tend to do, blending into one another until the line between what happened and what was meant becomes soft and indistinct. Their great longhouses, some of them reaching 100 feet or more in length, housed many families together under one roof, filled with the low sounds of daily life, the smell of wood smoke and stored corn, the warmth of bodies and fires in the long winter months. The governance of these communities was deeply influenced by women, particularly the clan mothers who held significant authority over political decisions, who had the power to select and remove leaders, who held the community together in ways that were fundamental and often overlooked in later historical accounts. All across the continent, by the time European ships began to appear on the eastern horizon, somewhere between 5 and 15 million people were living their lives in this enormous and varied land. Some scholars suggest the number may have been even higher. These were not primitive or simple people wandering through a wilderness. They were the inheritors of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, of carefully developed relationships with particular landscapes, of languages and stories, and ceremonial traditions of profound depth and beauty. They had built cities and roads and trade networks. They had developed agricultural systems that sustained large populations. They had created art of great sophistication and governance systems of genuine complexity. They understood the land they lived on with an intimacy born of very long acquaintance, knowing which plants were edible and which were medicinal, knowing the patterns of weather and season, knowing how to move through a landscape that, to an outside eye, might seem impenetrable, but was to them as readable as any book. This world was not a static one, frozen in some timeless state of nature. It was a dynamic world, full of change and movement, of rising and falling civilizations, of migrations and trade and cultural exchange and occasional conflict. Cultures came into contact with one another along trading routes and were changed by the encounter. Ideas and technologies moved slowly across the continent in ways we can sometimes trace and sometimes only guess at. Populations grew and shifted. Climates changed, slowly but perceptibly over generations, forcing adaptations and sometimes abandonment of long-settled places. The world of pre-contact North America was alive and in motion, the way all human worlds always are. And through all of this, the land itself continued its own slow, ancient processes, indifferent to the human dramas playing out upon it. The great rivers moved toward the sea. The forests grew and fell and grew again. The bison moved across the plains in rhythms determined by grass and weather and the slow turning of the seasons. The mountains stood in their places, cold and still and very old. The deserts held their heat and their silence. And the people who lived in all of these places went about the quiet business of their lives, planting and harvesting, hunting and fishing, building and mending, telling stories and raising children and carrying the long weight of their history forward into each new generation. This was the world as it existed on the eve of a change so large and so consequential that it would alter almost everything. But that change came slowly, too, at first. It came as a few small ships appearing on a distant horizon, growing gradually closer across many miles of open water, their sails filling with the same wind that bent the grasses on the shore and ruffled the surface of the rivers. It came with the smell of salt water and the sound of waves. It came without announcement, without warning, drifting toward the land the way all significant things drift, slowly, and then all at once. But for now, in the soft, slow space of this first chapter, we rest in the world before. We let the forests stand uncut and the rivers run clear and the plains stretch on and on toward a horizon that seems, if you walk toward it long enough, to simply keep retreating, gently forever, into the warm and fading light. There is something about the edge of the ocean that invites a particular kind of stillness. The place where land meets water, where the solid and the shifting come together in a long, slow meeting of foam and sand, and the smell of salt and seaweed drying in the afternoon sun. If you stand on the eastern shore of North America and look out toward the horizon, you see nothing at first but water, an enormous, unhurried expanse of gray-green sea moving in long, gentle swells toward the place where it dissolves into sky. For thousands of years, the people who stood on that shore looked out at that horizon and saw nothing but more horizon. And then, one day, very gradually, something appeared in the distance. Small at first, barely distinguishable from the white caps, growing slowly larger as the wind carried it closer, resolving itself over the course of hours into the shape of a sail, and beneath the sail, a hull, and beneath the hull, the dark line of a shadow moving across the surface of the water. The first European contact with the Americas came not from the east but from the north, quietly and without much lasting consequence at first. Norse seafarers, sailing from settlements in Iceland and Greenland, reached the northeastern coast of North America sometime around the year 1000, following the long chain of islands and coastlines that stretches across the North Atlantic like a series of stepping stones. They established a small settlement at a place they called Vinland, which most researchers believe was located somewhere on the island of Newfoundland, in what is now Canada. The remains of this settlement, excavated at a place called Elance aux Meadows, are quiet and modest. A few low earthen structures, some iron nails, the remnants of a forge, the kind of traces that suggest a small group of people who stayed for a time and then left. The Norse visitors and the indigenous peoples they encountered did not find a way to coexist peacefully, and the settlement was abandoned after only a few years. The memory of it faded back into the fog and the cold water of the North Atlantic, preserved only in the Icelandic sagas, which told the story in language that was already old and distant by the time anyone in southern Europe thought to take much notice. It was nearly 5 centuries later that the contact which would truly and permanently change the world finally came, drifting out of the late 15th century on the warm winds of the Atlantic. In the autumn of 1492, 3 small ships sailed westward from the Canary Islands under the command of a Genoese navigator sailing in the service of the Spanish crown. His name in the Spanish of his time was Cristobal Colon, though history has come to know him by a Latinized version, Christopher Columbus. He believed, based on his reading of various geographical theories and his own calculations, that Asia could be reached by sailing west, and that the distance involved was manageable. He was wrong about the distance, and wrong about what he had found when land finally appeared on the horizon after 33 days at sea. But the consequences of his arrival on an island in what are now the Bahamas were so far-reaching and so slow in their full unfolding that they are still being felt today. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas in the years that followed, never fully accepting that what he had reached was not Asia, but something else entirely, a vast landmass that existed in no European map or imagination. Other explorers came after him, sailing under the flags of Spain, Portugal, England, and France, each probing the coastlines and river mouths of this new world with careful, patient curiosity, mapping what they found, naming places after themselves and their patrons and their saints, slowly constructing a picture of a continent that grew clearer and more detailed with each passing decade. The process was gradual, the way all processes of understanding are gradual, built from the accumulation of many small observations into something that begins, eventually, to resemble a larger truth. Spain moved first and most forcefully into the Americas, establishing colonies on the islands of the Caribbean, and then, in the early 16th century, pushing onto the mainland. The conquest of the great Aztec Empire in central Mexico between 1519 and 1521, led by a small group of Spanish soldiers under the command of Hernán Cortés, was enabled not only by Spanish weapons and tactics, but also by the devastating spread of European diseases among populations that had no previous exposure to illnesses like smallpox and measles. The consequences of this disease transmission, which moved far ahead of the Europeans themselves, spreading through trade networks and human contact before any European foot had touched a particular piece of ground, were vast and terrible and unfolded over the course of decades, reducing indigenous populations across the Americas by estimates that range widely but consistently suggest losses of catastrophic proportions. This is one of the quieter and more sorrowful facts of this chapter of history. The way a sickness can move through a landscape like weather, invisibly and without intention, changing everything it touches. Spanish exploration of what is now the continental United States began in the early 16th century, moving up from the established colonies of Mexico and the Caribbean in long, slow arcs of exploration. In 1513, a Spanish explorer named Juan Ponce de Leon sailed along the coast of a flat, warm peninsula covered in palmettos and mangroves and the smell of flowering plants, a place he named La Florida, the flowery land, from the Spanish word for flower. He was not the first European to see this coast, but his expedition is the first documented one, and his name has remained attached to the place ever since, quietly embedded in the landscape like a stone in a riverbed. Other Spanish expeditions followed, probing deeper into the interior of the continent. Between 1539 and 1542, an expedition led by Hernando de Soto moved through the southeastern part of the continent in a long, wandering journey that passed through what are now the states of Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and possibly further, covering thousands of miles of forest and river valley and open plain in a journey that was exhausting and sometimes violent and ultimately inconclusive in terms of finding the wealth and glory the expedition had been seeking. What it did find was a vast and varied landscape, still inhabited by the descendants of the Mississippian culture, their mounds still standing, their villages still occupied, though already altered in ways both visible and invisible by the diseases that had preceded the Spanish arrival. De Soto died somewhere along the Mississippi River in 1542, and his expedition dissolved back into the landscape, leaving behind it a trail of disruption and the memory of a great river moving slowly through a flat and forested plain. Further west, another Spanish expedition led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado between 1540 and 1542 moved northward from Mexico into the arid landscape of the southwest, passing through the lands of the Pueblo peoples, climbing high desert plateaus and crossing flat, windswept grasslands in search of cities of gold that had been described by earlier travelers in terms that were perhaps more hopeful than accurate. What Coronado found instead were stone villages and vast plains, and the slow, heavy movement of enormous bison herds across the grass, stretching in every direction to the horizon. He reached what is now Kansas before turning back, having found no gold but having traveled through a landscape of austere and quiet beauty that left an impression on those who saw it. Something in the quality of the light, the way it fell across the red and ochre stone of the mesas, the way the distances seemed to expand and breathe in the dry, clean air. The Spanish eventually established permanent settlements in the southwest and along the coasts of Florida, building missions and presidios, small outposts of stone and adobe that sat in the landscape like quiet declarations of intent. The oldest continuously occupied European-founded city in what is now the United States is St. Augustine, Florida. Established by Spanish settlers in 1565 on a low, sandy stretch of coast where the air smelled of salt and the tall grasses bent in the sea wind. It was built as a military outpost and a base for the Catholic missionaries who followed the soldiers, and it has remained occupied ever since, its narrow streets and old stone buildings carrying the long weight of their age quietly, the way all old places do. Further north, English and French interest in the continent grew slowly through the late 16th and into the 17th century. England's first attempts at establishing a permanent colony on the North American coast ended in quiet failure. In 1585, a group of English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island, a low, wooded strip of land off the coast of what is now North Carolina, separated from the mainland by a stretch of shallow, warm water. They established a settlement, struggled with the difficulties of the new environment, returned to England for supplies, and when a resupply ship finally arrived in 1590, found the settlement abandoned, its structures empty, the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post, and nothing else. The settlers had vanished so completely that their fate has never been definitively established, becoming one of those quiet historical mysteries that drifts through the centuries without resolution, like a half-remembered dream. The first successful English settlement in North America was established in 1607, on a low, marshy peninsula jutting into a wide, slow river in what is now the state of Virginia. The settlers named their settlement Jamestown, after their king, James I, and the river they named the James as well, staking their modest claim in the landscape with familiar names from home. The site they chose was defensible from attack by sea, which was one of the considerations that had guided the decision, but it was also low and swampy and surrounded by brackish water, conditions that contributed to disease and to the slow, patient suffering that characterized the settlement's early years. The story of Jamestown's survival is a story of gradual adaptation and difficult learning, of a group of people slowly coming to understand a world that was entirely unlike anything they had known. Many of the early settlers were gentlemen or craftsmen with skills that were of limited use in the new environment, who had expected to find easily exploitable wealth, and instead found hard, unfamiliar labor and an unforgiving landscape. Disease thinned their numbers in the first years with a quiet, relentless efficiency. Starvation threatened in the winters. The relationship with the neighboring Powhatan Confederacy, a complex network of Algonquian-speaking peoples who inhabited the tidal rivers and forests of the region, shifted slowly between cautious exchange and open conflict, never settling into any stable arrangement for very long. What saved Jamestown, or rather what transformed it from a fragile, struggling outpost into something more permanent, was the discovery that a particular variety of tobacco grew exceptionally well in the Virginia soil. Tobacco had been known to Europeans since their earliest contacts with the Americas, but its cultivation as a commercial crop in the English colonies began in earnest after 1612, when a settler named John Rolfe began experimenting with a milder West Indian variety better suited to European tastes than the local species. The first shipment of Virginia tobacco reached England in 1614, and its reception was warm. Demand grew slowly at first, then more quickly, and as it grew, the colony grew with it, tobacco fields spreading across the tidal lowlands, each field representing the cleared forest of another season. The black soil turned up and planted and tended in the warm Virginia summers. The cultivation of tobacco required a great deal of labor, more than could easily be supplied by the stream of English immigrants, many of whom came as indentured servants, agreeing to work for a period of years in exchange for their passage and the eventual promise of land. The first African people arrived in Virginia in 1619, brought by a Dutch trading vessel, their status in those early years uncertain and complex, some of them serving as indentured servants much as white workers did, eventually earning their freedom and in some cases acquiring land and servants of their own. But gradually, over the decades that followed, the legal and social framework around African labor hardened into the institution of chattel slavery, a system in which human beings were defined as property, their labor extracted without compensation, their freedom and their children's freedom extinguished by law. This hardening happened slowly, through a series of legislative acts and legal decisions that accumulated over the middle decades of the 17th century, each one adding another layer to a structure that would eventually become one of the most consequential and most sorrowful facts of American history. For now, in these early colonial decades, it was still taking its shape, quietly, and without much notice from the historians of the time. Further north, along the rocky, cold coast of what the English called New England, a different kind of settlement was taking root. In the autumn of 1620, a ship called the Mayflower arrived off the coast of Cape Cod after a long, difficult crossing of the Atlantic, carrying a group of passengers who had crossed the ocean for reasons that were as much spiritual as economic. A portion of this group were separatists, members of a Protestant sect who had broken from the Church of England and sought a place where they could worship according to their own understanding of Scripture, without interference from the state. They had originally intended to settle in the northern part of Virginia, but were blown off course, landing instead on the cold, rocky shores of what would become Massachusetts. They arrived in late November, when the deciduous trees had long since dropped their leaves, and the ground was growing hard with the first frosts of winter. The landscape they saw from the ship's rail was gray and brown and cold, the low hills covered in bare trees and scrubby vegetation, the shore a line of sand and stone beaten by the gray Atlantic. It was not a welcoming scene. And the winter that followed was hard, as many of the settlement's early winters would be, cold and hungry and full of illness, the ground too frozen for planting, the settlers too unprepared for the severity of the New England climate. Nearly half of the Mayflower's passengers died in that first winter, their graves dug in the frozen ground on a hill above the small settlement they had named Plymouth. Those who survived learned slowly from the indigenous peoples of the region, particularly from a Patuxent man named Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto, who had spent time in England and spoke some English, and who showed the settlers how to plant corn in the manner of the local peoples, using fish buried in the soil as fertilizer, and where to find the most productive fishing grounds along the coast. The relationship between the Plymouth settlers and the neighboring Wampanoag people was initially one of cautious cooperation, formalized in a treaty negotiated in the spring of 1621 that expressed, at least in its stated terms, a mutual commitment to peaceful coexistence. It was a fragile arrangement, as such arrangements tend to be, but it held for a time, long enough for the small settlement to find its footing and begin the slow, patient work of becoming permanent. Through the 1620s and 1630s, more English settlers arrived in New England, driven by a mixture of religious conviction, economic calculation, and the simple human desire for land and the security that land represented. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, established in 1630 under a charter from the English crown, brought a much larger wave of Puritan settlers who carried with them an ambitious and deeply held vision of what their new community should be. Their leader, John Winthrop, spoke of their settlement as a city upon a hill, a phrase weighted with biblical resonance, suggesting a community watched by the whole world, called to embody a particular kind of godly order. This sense of purpose and election shaped the culture of early New England in ways that persisted for generations, quietly embedded in the institutions and assumptions of the communities that grew from those early Puritan foundations. The towns of early New England grew in ways that reflected this sense of communal purpose. Each town was organized around a common, a shared open space at its center, bordered by the meeting house where both worship and civic business took place, and by the houses of the minister and other leading families. Fields were distributed around the edges of the common, and the town was governed by regular meetings of its male members, who deliberated on matters of common concern in a process that, while limited in its inclusiveness by modern standards, represented a genuine and practiced form of local self-governance. The smell of wood smoke from hearth fires drifted through the cold air of these towns in winter, and the sound of church bells marked the passage of the days and weeks. The relationship between all these English settlers and the indigenous peoples of the regions they inhabited was complicated and largely sorrowful in its trajectory. In the early decades, there were moments of genuine exchange and mutual accommodation, instances of learning and cooperation that suggested the possibility of coexistence. But the pressure of an increasing settler population, the steady encroachment on indigenous lands, the spread of disease, and the deep differences in cultural assumptions about land ownership and its meaning created tensions that resolved themselves, time and again, into conflict. In New England, a widespread and devastating conflict known as King Philip's War, fought between 1675 and 1678, resulted in the deaths of thousands of people on both sides and the destruction of dozens of settlements, both English and indigenous, effectively ending any possibility of sustained indigenous resistance to English expansion in the region. The war left the landscape quiet and scarred, the forests full of burned foundations and quiet grief. The Dutch established their own foothold in the region during this period, settling along the Hudson River in what they called New Netherland, establishing a trading post at the southern tip of Manhattan Island that they named New Amsterdam. This settlement, established primarily as a commercial venture by the Dutch West India Company, was a remarkably diverse place by the standards of its time, drawing settlers from across Europe and including, from its earliest years, a significant population of enslaved Africans who performed much of the labor that sustained the colony. In 1664, English warships appeared in the harbor and the Dutch governor, outgunned and undersupplied, surrendered the colony without a fight. New Amsterdam became New York, and the Dutch influence in the region gradually faded into the background of the culture, leaving behind it only place names and architectural details, and the memory of a different kind of colonial world. The Middle Colonies, the region between New England and Virginia that would eventually become New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were the most diverse part of English colonial America, drawing settlers from Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, and the British Isles, each group bringing with them their own languages and customs and religious traditions, and slowly weaving them together into something new. Pennsylvania, founded in 1681 by William Penn as a haven for Quakers and other religious minorities, was particularly notable for its early commitment to peaceful relations with the local Lenape people, and for the relative religious tolerance that Penn's governing principles encouraged. The city Penn laid out along the Delaware River, Philadelphia, grew quickly from a grid of streets and modest houses into one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the English-speaking world by the middle of the 18th century, its streets busy with the quiet commerce of a thriving port. Life in these colonial settlements, wherever they were located, had a particular texture that was shaped by the demands of the environment and the rhythms of the agricultural year. Most colonial families lived on farms, small holdings of cleared land surrounded by forest, where the work of maintaining a household and producing enough food to survive required the labor of every family member from the time they were old enough to be useful. The pace of this life was slow and physical, shaped by the turning of the seasons. Spring meant plowing and planting, the smell of turned earth and the sound of birdsong returning to the fields. Summer meant tending and growing, long days of warmth and the gradual swelling of crops in the fields. Autumn meant harvest, the gathering and storing of everything that would sustain the family through the winter months. And winter meant drawing inward. The family gathered close around the fire in the long evenings, the work shifting to indoor tasks, the world outside cold and dark and very still. The social world of colonial America was structured by hierarchies of gender, race, and class that shaped every aspect of daily life in ways both visible and invisible. At the top of the colonial social order were wealthy planters in the South, prosperous merchants in the North, the owners of land and ships, and in the South increasingly, the owners of enslaved people. Below them were the middling sorts, the artisans and farmers and shopkeepers who made up the bulk of free society. And below them, in conditions that varied in their degrees of constraint and hardship, were indentured servants, free black people navigating a world that hedged their freedoms on every side, and the hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans and African Americans whose labor built much of the colonial economy, particularly in the tobacco and rice and indigo plantations of the South, and whose humanity was defined out of existence by law and custom, so that the contradiction at the heart of a society speaking increasingly of liberty could be maintained without too much discomfort for those at the top. By the mid-18th century, the 13 English colonies that stretched along the eastern seaboard from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south held a population of roughly 2.5 million people, a mixture of indigenous peoples still holding onto portions of their ancestral territories, European settlers of various national origins and religious persuasions, and African people, mostly enslaved, whose numbers made up roughly 20% of the total colonial population. These colonies were distinct from one another in many ways, their economies and social structures and religious cultures shaped by the particularities of their histories and their geographies. And yet they were also connected, by trade and by shared language and by the slowly developing consciousness of a common situation, a common relationship to the distant authority of the English crown that was, by the 1760s, beginning to feel increasingly uncomfortable. The towns of colonial America had their own particular sounds and smells, their own textures of daily life that we can only partially reconstruct from the records they left behind. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer in the morning air, the smell of bread baking in a stone oven, the warm, yeasty smell drifting through an open window into a dusty street, the creak of wooden signs above tavern doors in the wind, the low murmur of conversation in a market square, the clatter of cart wheels on cobblestones, the distant sound of church bells ringing the hour in the clear morning air. In the South, the slow movement of people along unpaved roads between widely scattered farms, the dense green of tobacco fields in summer, the smell of curring sheds where the harvested leaves dried slowly in the warm air. In New England, the white spires of meeting houses rising above the autumn foliage, the dark smell of wood smoke on a cold morning, the sound of the sea not very far away. All of this was, in its way, a kind of preparation, a long, slow settling into a landscape, a gradual building of communities and institutions and habits of mind that would eventually, when the circumstances were right, provide the material from which something new could be made. The colonial world was not yet the United States of America. It was something older and more various, and in many ways more uncertain, a collection of communities finding their way in a new world, carrying with them the weight of everything they had brought from elsewhere and slowly, almost imperceptibly, being changed by the particular place they had come to inhabit. The change was gradual. It always is. But it was coming, like weather moving in from the west, like the slow shift of a season from one thing into something else, felt before it is fully understood, arriving before anyone is entirely prepared for it. The forest stood at the edges of the cleared fields, patient and dark and very old. The rivers moved toward the sea. The long colonial days turned one into the next, season into season, year into year, each one carrying the story a little further along its slow and winding course, toward something that had not yet been named, toward a future that was forming itself gradually out of the particular combination of people and place and time that the colonial world had quietly assembled over the course of a century and a half. And for now, in the gathering dusk of this second chapter, we let the candles in the colonial windows burn low, and the fires settle into coals, and the night comes softly over the sleeping towns, and all of it grows still. There is a particular quality to the light in the hours just before dawn, when the sky has not yet decided to become day, but has already stopped being night. It is a soft, indeterminate light, gray and blue and very still, the kind of light in which shapes are visible but details are not yet fully resolved, in which the world seems to be gathering itself slowly toward something without quite having arrived there yet. The years leading up to the American Revolution had something of that quality about them. A gradual brightening of something that had not yet declared itself. A slow accumulation of tension and thought and feeling that moved through the colonial world like a change in the weather, felt in the bones before it was visible in the sky, understood in the body before it was articulated in words. The seeds of what would become the American Revolution were planted not in any single dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of many small frictions and gradual shifts of understanding that unfolded over roughly a decade and a half, from the early 1760s through the middle of the 1770s. To understand where these frictions came from, It helps to settle back into the broader world of the mid-18th century for a moment, to feel the weight of the larger forces that were pressing on the small, scattered communities of the eastern seaboard, shaping the conditions in which new ideas could take root and grow. Britain and France had been contesting control of the North American interior for decades, their rivalry playing out in a series of wars that involved not only European soldiers, but also the indigenous peoples of the continent, who had their own interests and their own calculations about which European power they might most profitably align themselves with, or play against the other. The final and most consequential of these conflicts, known in North America as the French and Indian War, and in its broader European context as the 7 Years' War, concluded in 1763 with a British victory that removed France from its position as a major colonial power in North America. Britain now controlled an enormous territory, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River, and the administration and defense of this territory presented the British government with a set of logistical and financial challenges that it had not previously had to face. The war had been expensive. Britain emerged from it with a national debt of considerable proportions, and the government's attention turned, in the years that followed, to the question of how to pay for the ongoing cost of administering and defending its expanded North American empire. The answer that presented itself seemed straightforward enough from London. The colonists, who had benefited from the war's outcome, should contribute to its costs through taxation. A series of new revenue measures were proposed and passed by the British Parliament in the mid-1760s, beginning with the Stamp Act of 1765, which required that a wide variety of printed materials in the colonies, from legal documents to newspapers to playing cards, bear a tax stamp purchased from royal distributors. The colonial response to these measures was not immediate or explosive, but rather gradual, a slow warming of objection that began in the language of practical grievance and moved over time toward something more philosophical. The core of the colonial argument was not simply that the taxes were burdensome, though some of them were, but that they were illegitimate because they had been imposed by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation. This argument, summarized in the phrase that would become something of a watchword for the colonial position, "No taxation without representation," drew on a long tradition of English constitutional thought about the rights of subjects and the limits of governmental authority. The colonists were not, in their own understanding, radicals or revolutionaries in these early years. They were Englishmen asserting what they understood to be their English rights, appealing to principles that they believed were already established and recognized. The debate between Britain and the colonies over the question of parliamentary authority unfolded through pamphlets and newspaper essays and town meeting resolutions, through the deliberations of colonial assemblies, and the correspondence of men and women who were thinking carefully and at length about questions of government and liberty, and the proper relationship between a ruler and the ruled. It was a long, slow conversation, conducted mostly in ink on paper, in the careful, measured prose of the 18th century, full of classical allusions and legal arguments, and the particular kind of formal eloquence that the educated men of that era brought to questions they considered important. Reading it now, the pace of it feels almost geological, ideas shifting against each other with the patience of continental plates. The change is visible only when you step back far enough to see the full extent of what has moved. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, following widespread colonial resistance that included organized boycotts of British goods and the destruction of stamp distributors' property in several colonial cities. But the British government simultaneously passed a declaratory act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all matters whatsoever, a declaration that left the underlying constitutional question entirely unresolved. New revenue measures followed, the Townshend Acts of 1767 imposing duties on a range of imported goods, and with them came new rounds of colonial protest and new rounds of partial, unsatisfying British response. The pattern repeated itself with a kind of slow, patient inevitability, each cycle leaving the two sides a little further apart, the accumulated weight of grievance and suspicion making compromise a little more difficult each time. British troops had been stationed in Boston since 1768, their presence a source of constant irritation in a city that was already one of the most politically agitated in the colonies. The soldiers and the townspeople regarded each other with a mutual wariness that occasionally flared into confrontation. On a cold March evening in 1770, a confrontation between a crowd of Bostonians and a small group of British soldiers escalated slowly and then suddenly into violence, with the soldiers firing into the crowd and killing 5 people. The event was quickly given a name that emphasized its most dramatic quality, the Boston Massacre, and was circulated through the colonies in engravings and pamphlets that depicted it in terms designed to stoke outrage. In reality, the confrontation was more ambiguous than the name suggested, more confused and frightened and sad than heroic, but its symbolic resonance was real and lasting, hardening attitudes on both sides and adding another layer of weight to the slow accumulation of estrangement. The years between 1770 and 1773 were relatively quiet, a period of reduced tension during which it might have seemed possible, to someone watching from a distance, that the conflict between Britain and its colonies might still find some peaceful resolution. But the quiet was more apparent than real, a surface stillness over water that was still moving in its depths. And in December of 1773, a group of men dressed as Mohawk Indians made their way quietly through the streets of Boston to the waterfront, boarded 3 ships belonging to the East India Company, and over the course of several hours methodically broke open 342 chests of tea and poured the contents into the dark water of Boston Harbor. The tea drifted on the surface of the harbor in the cold night air, spreading slowly outward from the ships, its smell sharp and strange in the saltan mud smell of the waterfront. The British government's response to what became known as the Boston Tea Party was firm and punitive, a series of measures that the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port, restricting the powers of the Massachusetts colonial government, and requiring colonists to house British soldiers. These measures were intended to isolate and punish Massachusetts, and to demonstrate that Parliament's authority was not to be challenged with impunity. Their effect was precisely the opposite, drawing the other colonies into a closer solidarity with Massachusetts than might otherwise have formed, the shared sense of grievance pulling communities that had previously understood themselves as quite distinct from one another into something that felt increasingly like a common cause. In September of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for what they called the First Continental Congress. They met in a city that was, by colonial standards, large and prosperous and cosmopolitan, its streets busy with the commerce of a busy port, its taverns and coffee houses full of conversation, and the smell of tobacco and wood smoke. The delegates were, for the most part, men of substance and education, lawyers and planters and merchants who had spent years thinking about the questions now before them, who came with their own particular perspectives and interests and ways of understanding the situation. They deliberated for 7 weeks, producing a declaration of colonial rights and an agreement to suspend trade with Britain until their grievances were addressed. They were not yet talking about independence. The thought was still distant, still unformed, still frightening to most of them in the way that very large changes are always frightening before their necessity becomes clear. The winter of 1774 into 1775 passed with a quiet that felt, to those living through it, like the stillness before something, though no one could say with certainty what that something would be. In Massachusetts, colonial militias were quietly organizing and training, storing arms and ammunition against the possibility of conflict. British military commanders in Boston were aware of these preparations and were under pressure from London to act decisively. In April of 1775, British troops were dispatched from Boston on a nighttime march to the town of Concord, some 18 miles distant, with orders to seize a cache of colonial arms that had been stored there. The colonists had their own networks of watchers and riders, and word of the British movement traveled through the night ahead of the soldiers, carried by men on horseback along roads that wound through the dark Massachusetts countryside, past fields and forests still cold with the last of the winter. At dawn on the 19th of April, a small group of colonial militia stood on the village green at Lexington, a quiet town along the road to Concord, as the column of British soldiers approached. What happened next unfolded in the confusion and uncertainty of a cold morning, with both sides uncertain of the other's intentions, neither side wanting to fire the first shot, the tension building slowly until a shot was fired, by whom no one was ever entirely certain, and then more shots, and men falling on the green, and the British column pressing on toward Concord while behind it the village of Lexington tried to comprehend what had just happened. At Concord, the British found that most of the arms they had come for had already been moved, and as they made their way back toward Boston, colonial militiamen gathered along the road from farms and villages, firing from behind stone walls and trees and the cover of the rolling New England countryside, and the British retreat became a long, painful ordeal, the soldiers moving through a landscape that had suddenly become hostile, every rise and bend in the road a potential source of danger. The news of Lexington and Concord spread through the colonies over the days and weeks that followed with the particular speed that urgent news always traveled in the 18th century, carried by riders and reprinted in newspapers and read aloud in taverns and town squares, each retelling adding its own weight to the spreading consciousness that something irrevocable had begun. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May of 1775, and within weeks had taken on the functions of a government, appointing a Virginian named George Washington to command the colonial forces that were gathering around Boston. Washington was a tall, quiet man with a gift for projecting calm authority, a Virginia planter who had served in the French and Indian War, and who brought to his new command a combination of personal dignity and practical determination that would prove, over the long years ahead, to be exactly what the situation required. The war that followed was long and difficult, lasting from 1775 until 1783, fought across a geography that stretched from New England to the southern colonies, and eventually involved not only the American forces, but also France, Spain, and the Netherlands on the American side and Hessian mercenary soldiers on the British side. It was not a war of grand, decisive battles, though there were battles. It was largely a war of endurance, of maintaining an army in the field through winter after winter of cold and scarcity, of keeping enough men under arms and enough political will behind the effort to prevent the whole enterprise from dissolving back into the weight of inertia and doubt. There were long stretches when the prospect of American success seemed very uncertain, when the Continental Army was reduced to a few thousand hungry, poorly equipped men moving through the cold countryside, pursued by a more powerful and better supplied adversary. Through all of this, the question of what exactly the colonists were fighting for was gradually clarifying itself. In the early months of the war, most colonial leaders were still careful to frame their cause in terms of restoring their rights within the British Empire, rather than separating from it entirely. Independence was a step that many thoughtful people approached with caution, aware of its enormous implications, uncertain whether the colonies had the resources and capacity to sustain themselves as an independent nation. The arguments in favor of independence gathered force slowly, through the pamphlets and essays and conversations of 1775 and into 1776, and they found their most powerful popular expression in a pamphlet published in January of 1776 by a recent English immigrant named Thomas Paine. In Common Sense, Paine argued for independence in language that was deliberately accessible, written not in the elevated prose of educated discourse, but in plain, direct sentences designed to reach the widest possible audience. He argued that monarchy was an absurdity, that the connection with Britain had brought the colonies more harm than benefit, and that independence was not merely desirable but inevitable, a matter of common sense. The pamphlet circulated through the colonies at remarkable speed, passing from hand to hand and being read aloud in public places, its arguments settling into the minds of people who had not previously allowed themselves to think quite so clearly about where all of this was heading. In June of 1776, the Continental Congress took up a resolution for independence, and a committee of 5 men was appointed to draft a formal declaration setting forth the reasons for the break. The primary work of writing fell to Thomas Jefferson, a 33-year-old Virginia lawyer and planter with a gift for clear, elegant prose and a deep familiarity with the philosophical traditions of the European Enlightenment. He worked in a rented room in Philadelphia over the course of several weeks, the city warm and humid in the June heat, and what he produced was a document of remarkable rhetorical clarity and force, grounded in the political philosophy of John Locke and the broader tradition of natural rights theory, asserting that all men are created equal, endowed with certain unalienable rights, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Declaration of Independence was formally adopted by the Continental Congress on the 4th of July, 1776, a date that would be commemorated for centuries afterward, with a depth of feeling that accumulates quietly across generations. The document was read aloud in public squares and from the steps of meeting houses across the colonies, its words entering the air and the memory of everyone who heard them. It was a beginning, not an ending, a declaration of intent rather than an accomplished fact, but it gave the long struggle ahead of it a clarity of purpose that it had previously lacked. There was now something definite to fight for, a vision of what the nation being born from this conflict might aspire to be. The years of the war continued their slow, difficult unfolding. The winter of 1777 and 1778, which Washington's army spent encamped at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, has become in the national memory a symbol of endurance, of the quiet suffering and stubborn persistence that the Revolution required of those who fought it. The encampment sat on a low plateau above the Schuylkill River, the army's huts scattered across a landscape of frozen fields and leafless trees, the cold Pennsylvania winter pressing in on every side. The men were hungry and poorly clothed, their shoes worn through, their supplies inadequate, illness moving through the camp with patient, quiet efficiency. And yet the army held together, drilled through the cold days under the instruction of a Prussian officer named Friedrich von Steuben, who had come to offer his services to the American cause, slowly being shaped into something more disciplined and effective than it had been when it arrived. The entry of France into the war on the American side in 1778 changed the strategic situation significantly, providing the Americans with naval support, supplies, and a military alliance that made the prospect of British victory considerably more complicated. The war in the South became the primary theater of operations in the later years, with British forces moving through the Carolinas and Georgia in campaigns that had significant early successes, but ultimately failed to establish the durable loyalist base the British had hoped for. The final major campaign of the war was fought in Virginia, where a British army under Lord Cornwallis was gradually maneuvered by Washington's forces and a French fleet into a position at Yorktown, on the Virginia Peninsula, from which there was no escape. The siege that followed was conducted with the patient deliberateness that siege warfare always required, artillery batteries established and trenches dug, and the circle of American and French forces tightening slowly around the British positions over the course of several weeks in the autumn of 1781. When Cornwallis surrendered on the 19th of October, the band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," a choice that captured something true about the strangeness of what had just been accomplished. Peace negotiations unfolded slowly over the following 2 years, conducted in Paris by American diplomats including Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, resulting in a treaty signed in September of 1783 that recognized American independence and established the boundaries of the new nation as extending westward to the Mississippi River. The war was over. The nation whose existence had been declared in 1776 was now recognized by the international community as a real and sovereign thing. But the work of actually making it function, of transforming a declaration and a military victory into a working government and a coherent national society, was still largely ahead. The years immediately following the Revolution were years of gradual construction and considerable uncertainty, a period that historians call the critical period, when the weaknesses of the first framework of national government, established under the Articles of Confederation, made themselves increasingly apparent. The Articles had created a Congress with limited powers, no authority to levy taxes, and no executive or judicial branch to enforce its decisions. Each state retained most of its sovereignty, and the national government existed largely as a forum for negotiation between 13 essentially independent political units. The limitations of this arrangement became clear as the new nation faced the practical challenges of managing debt, regulating commerce, and maintaining order. The response to these limitations was the Constitutional Convention, which met in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787, 55 delegates gathering in the same building, where the Declaration had been signed 11 years earlier, working through the long, hot months with the windows closed to preserve the confidentiality of their deliberations. The city's summer sounds muffled behind the heavy wooden shutters. The convention produced, after months of slow, careful, sometimes contentious debate, the document that would become the United States Constitution, a framework for national government that balanced the competing interests of large and small states, of those who wanted a strong central government, and those who feared the concentration of power, of the northern states where slavery was declining, and the southern states where it was central to the economy. The Constitution that emerged from this process was a document of considered compromises, each of its provisions the product of long deliberation and the gradual working out of agreements between men with genuinely different interests and views. It was not a perfect document, and those who wrote it knew it was not perfect, which is why they included provisions for its amendment. Its most glaring moral failure was its accommodation of slavery, which it protected and reinforced in several of its provisions, without ever naming the institution directly, as though the framers hoped that by not using the word they might somehow avoid the full weight of what they were doing. This accommodation would cast a long shadow across the decades that followed, its consequences unfolding slowly and painfully across the generations. The Constitution was ratified by the required 9 states by June of 1788, and the new government began its operations in the spring of 1789, with George Washington unanimously chosen as the nation's first president and taking the oath of office in New York City, which served as the temporary capital. He stood in the April sunlight, this tall, quiet Virginian who had spent 8 years holding an army together through the patient force of his presence, and placed his hand on a Bible and swore to preserve, protect, and defend a constitution that was only months old, for a nation that was still finding out what it was. The crowd that watched him was quiet and attentive, the moment settling into the air with the particular weight of things that will be remembered for a very long time. The early years of the new government were years of slow institution building, of establishing the precedents and practices that would give the abstract framework of the Constitution its practical shape. Washington's cabinet, the first such body in American history, was assembled with careful attention to geographical and ideological balance, including among its members 2 men whose disagreements about the nature and direction of the new nation would define the first great political division in American history. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, brilliant and impatient and deeply committed to a vision of a strong, commercially dynamic national government, and Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, more cautious in his trust of concentrated power, more committed to an agrarian vision of a nation of independent farmers, more suspicious of the financial and commercial interests that Hamilton sought to cultivate. Their disagreements were real and deep, and expressed in the most careful, elevated language of the era, and they eventually coalesced around them the first 2 American political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, whose competition shaped the political life of the early republic. Washington served 2 terms and then, in an act whose significance it is difficult to overstate, stepped down voluntarily, refusing a 3rd term and returning to his farm at Mount Vernon on the banks of the Potomac, where he died in December of 1799 at the age of 67. The voluntary relinquishment of power by the leader of a successful revolution was, at that point in history, something genuinely unusual, and it established a precedent that would hold for a century and a half. A quiet but powerful demonstration of the principle that power in a republic derives from and returns to the people, that no individual is indispensable, that the institutions are larger than the men who inhabit them. The nation that Washington left behind him was small by the standards of what it would become. Its population concentrated along the eastern seaboard, its institutions young and still finding their shape, its future genuinely uncertain in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from this distance. It had been born from a long conversation about liberty and rights and the proper limits of government, a conversation that was in many ways still ongoing, its most important questions still unanswered. What did it mean to say that all men were created equal in a nation where hundreds of thousands of people were held in slavery? What was the proper relationship between the national government and the states? How far west did the new nation's ambitions extend, and what would it mean for the land and for the people already living on it when those ambitions began to move in earnest? These were questions for the decades ahead. For now, in the quietness of this third chapter, we let the candles burn in the windows of the new republic's young cities, and the rivers move through their ancient channels, and the forests stand at the edges of the cleared fields, patient and dark and very old, as they have always been. The nation is young and uncertain, and full of the particular kind of hope that belongs to beginnings, to things that have not yet had time to discover all of their own contradictions. And the night settles softly over it, and the stars come out one by one over the Potomac and the Delaware and the broad, slow Hudson, and everything is very still. There is something about a wide, open landscape that invites a particular kind of quietness in the mind. When the eye has nothing to rest on, no wall or fence or tree line to stop its wandering, it simply keeps moving outward, following the flat or gently rolling surface of the land toward a horizon that seems always to be retreating, always to be just a little further away than it appeared a moment ago. The interior of the North American continent has this quality in abundance. Standing on the tallgrass prairie of what is now Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa on a still summer morning, with the grass moving in long, slow waves in a wind too gentle to feel on the skin, and the sky enormous overhead, pale blue shading to white at the edges, and the silence broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark and the soft, continuous rustling of the grass, you understand something about the 19th century that no amount of reading can fully convey. You understand why people looked at this landscape and felt, simultaneously, a deep and wordless longing and a very small sense of themselves. The westward movement of American settlement across the continent was one of the defining processes of the 19th century, a slow, immense, multi-generational shifting of people and animals and tools and ideas across an enormous geography, driven by a mixture of ambition and necessity, and the particular American belief, never fully examined but deeply held, that the land to the west represented possibility in its purest form, that moving toward it was moving toward something better, something freer, something more fully realized. This belief had a name that was given to it only in 1845 by a journalist named John O'Sullivan, who called it manifest destiny, the idea that the expansion of the United States across the continent was not merely desirable but inevitable, ordained by some combination of providence and the natural qualities of the American people. The phrase stuck because it named something that was already widely felt, giving a shape and a grandeur to impulses that had been driving settlement westward since the earliest colonial days. But before we follow the wagons and the railroads and the long, slow rivers of people moving across the continent, we need to settle for a moment into the early decades of the century, into the young republic still finding its shape along the eastern seaboard, still working out the implications of the remarkable and fragile thing it had become. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was perhaps the first great act of continental ambition in the new nation's history, though it arrived not through conflict or long planning, but through a convergence of circumstances that made it almost unexpectedly available. Napoleon Bonaparte, having abandoned his dreams of a French empire in the Americas following the successful slave revolt in Haiti led by Toussaint Louverture, offered to sell France's vast claim to the territory west of the Mississippi River to the United States, and President Thomas Jefferson, who had deep reservations about whether the Constitution authorized such a purchase, set those reservations gently aside and accepted. For approximately $15 million, the United States doubled its size overnight, acquiring a territory of nearly 830,000 square miles stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to what is now the Canadian border. Jefferson, curious and methodical as he was about almost everything, immediately set in motion an expedition to explore this new territory, to map it and describe its plants and animals and peoples and resources, to bring back from it knowledge of what exactly had been acquired. The Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, departed from the vicinity of St. Louis in the spring of 1804 and spent the next 2.5 years making its slow, careful way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean and back, traveling by boat and on foot through landscapes of extraordinary variety and beauty, keeping detailed journals of everything they observed, collecting plant and animal specimens, meeting the indigenous peoples of the interior with a mixture of diplomatic formality and genuine curiosity. Their journey moved at the pace of the rivers they followed, which is to say slowly and with long pauses, the boats making their way upstream against the current of the Missouri River through long summer days, the banks crowded with cottonwood trees and the air thick with the sound of birds, the men rowing and poling and pulling their boats through the brown, fast-moving water. They reached the Pacific in November of 1805, standing at the edge of the continent and looking out at the gray, heaving immensity of the ocean, and then they turned around and came home, arriving back in St. Louis in September of 1806, to a reception that reflected the genuine significance of what they had accomplished. Their journals, eventually published, gave the young nation its first detailed picture of the interior of the continent, describing landscapes that most Americans had never seen and could barely imagine: the high plains and the Rocky Mountains and the Columbia River country and the Pacific coast. The knowledge they brought back was absorbed slowly into the national consciousness, the way all knowledge is absorbed, gradually and unevenly, some of it taking root immediately, and some of it lying dormant for years before it began to shape the decisions of the people who received it. The early decades of the 19th century were years of gradual growth and shifting politics in the eastern part of the country, the young republic slowly consolidating its institutions and finding its way through a series of challenges, both foreign and domestic. The War of 1812, fought against Britain over a combination of trade disputes and the impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, was an inconclusive conflict whose most memorable moment was the burning of Washington by British troops in August of 1814, the flames of the Capitol and the White House visible from miles away in the summer night, a scene at once humbling and in the curious alchemy of national mythology, eventually transforming into something that confirmed the young nation's resilience. The war ended in a stalemate formalized by the Treaty of Ghent in December of 1814, settling nothing definitively, but leaving both sides ready to be done with the whole business and move forward. The years following the War of 1812 were called, somewhat hopefully, the era of good feelings, a period during which the intense partisan divisions of the early republic seemed temporarily to subside, the Federalist Party having dissolved and the Democratic Republicans facing no organized opposition. It was a surface harmony, built on the avoidance of the questions that would eventually prove most divisive rather than their resolution, but it had a genuine quality of expansiveness and optimism about it, a sense of a nation growing into its possibilities. Population was increasing steadily. New states were being admitted to the Union at regular intervals. The economy was developing in ways that created new opportunities for some even as it deepened the exploitation of others. New roads were being built, pushing further into the interior. Canals were being dug, connecting river systems and opening new routes for the movement of goods. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, running 363 miles from Albany on the Hudson River to Buffalo on Lake Erie, was the great engineering achievement of its era, transforming the economy of the entire Great Lakes region and demonstrating the possibilities of what patient, organized human effort could accomplish in the landscape. The question that the era of good feelings was most successfully avoiding was, of course, slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while establishing a geographic line across the Louisiana Territory above which slavery would be prohibited, was an attempt to manage this question by containing it, to keep it from spreading while not directly confronting it. It held for 3 decades, a fragile arrangement that preserved the surface peace by deferring the deeper reckoning that the nation's founding contradictions made ultimately unavoidable. But the compromise did not make the question go away. It simply submerged it, where it continued its slow, patient work beneath the surface of political life, shaping everything without being fully visible. Meanwhile, the westward movement was gathering its slow momentum. The land east of the Mississippi was filling up with settlers, the forests of the old Northwest gradually giving way to farms, new towns establishing themselves along the river banks and at the intersections of new roads. And beyond the Mississippi, the great prairie stretched away toward the Rockies, a landscape that early explorers had described as the Great American Desert, unsuitable for agriculture, a barrier rather than a destination. This assessment was wrong, as later farmers would discover, but it held sway for long enough to direct early settlement northward into the forested regions of what are now Illinois and Wisconsin and Minnesota, rather than out onto the open grasslands. In the southeast, the story of westward expansion had a particular and sorrowful dimension. The indigenous nations of the region, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, had been living in their territories for generations, adapting in various ways to the presence of European American settlers and the pressures of the expanding republic. The Cherokee, in particular, had developed a written language, a constitution, a newspaper, and a range of institutions that reflected a deliberate strategy of demonstrating, in terms that American political culture would recognize, the sophistication and stability of their society. None of it was sufficient protection against the combination of settler demand for their land and the political will of Andrew Jackson's administration to remove them. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the forced relocation of the southeastern nations to territory west of the Mississippi, in what is now Oklahoma. The removal was carried out over the following decade through a process that was slow in its planning and swift and brutal in its execution. Families torn from the land they had inhabited for generations, forced to travel hundreds of miles through cold and illness and grief to a new territory they had never seen. The Cherokee removal of 1838 and 1839, conducted largely in the cold months of winter, resulted in the deaths of thousands of people from exposure, disease, and exhaustion, along a path that the Cherokee themselves named Nunna-Daltsuni, the trail where they cried, and that history has come to call the Trail of Tears. The soldiers who oversaw the removal watched the long columns of people moving through the winter landscape, with expressions that some of them later described, in letters and journals, with something approaching shame. The land they left behind them was quickly occupied by settlers who had been waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for exactly this outcome. The acquisition of Texas added another vast territory to the expanding nation's geography, though through a process considerably more contested and violent than the Louisiana Purchase. American settlers had been moving into the Mexican province of Texas since the 1820s, invited initially by the Mexican government as a way of populating a sparsely settled border region, and by the mid-1830s, they outnumbered the Mexican population of the province significantly. Tensions between the settlers and the Mexican government over questions of local autonomy, taxes, and slavery, which Mexico had abolished but which the American settlers were determined to maintain, led to open conflict in 1835 and 1836, resulting in Texas declaring its independence. And after a series of engagements, including the famous 13-day siege of a former mission called the Alamo in San Antonio, establishing itself as an independent republic. Texas was annexed by the United States in 1845, and the Mexican-American War that followed from 1846 to 1848 resulted in Mexico ceding an enormous additional territory encompassing what are now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The continent was, from the perspective of the United States, nearly filled in. The discovery of gold in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California in January of 1848 sent a quiet tremor through the national consciousness that quickly grew into something much larger. Word spread slowly at first, then faster, carried by letters and newspapers and the word of mouth of returning sailors and travelers, until by 1849 it had reached every corner of the country and beyond, drawing toward California a flood of people from across the United States and from much of the world, the greatest voluntary mass migration in American history to that point. They came by sea, rounding Cape Horn or crossing the Isthmus of Panama, and they came overland, following the long, difficult trails across the plains and mountains that had been established by the fur traders and missionaries of the previous decade. They moved in wagons and on horseback and on foot, carrying what they could and abandoning what they couldn't, the trail west marked by the discarded possessions and the graves of those who didn't make it. The overland trails that carried settlers westward in the 1840s and 1850s crossed a landscape of extraordinary scale and variety, each stage of the journey presenting its own particular challenges and its own particular beauty. The eastern section followed the Platte River across the flat Nebraska plain, the river wide and shallow and pale brown, moving between low sandy banks through a landscape of grass and sky that seemed to go on forever, the wagons raising a long plume of dust that was visible for miles. The crossing of the Rocky Mountains required careful navigation of mountain passes. The wagons laboriously disassembled and carried in pieces up slopes too steep for wheels, then reassembled on the other side and loaded again for the descent. The Great Basin of what is now Nevada was a landscape of austere, dry beauty, pale with alkali flats and sage. The air so dry it cracked lips and made eyes ache. The distances between water sources long enough to be genuinely dangerous. Those who made this journey and survived it were changed by it, seasoned in some way that was hard to articulate but real and lasting. The landscape had gotten into them, its scale and its silence, and its indifference to human drama leaving a permanent impression on the sensibility of those who crossed it. The West that these travelers were moving toward was not empty, of course, despite the way it was sometimes described in the newspapers and pamphlets of the eastern cities. It was inhabited by numerous indigenous nations, each with their own long relationship to the specific landscapes they occupied, their own deep knowledge of the land and its resources, their own carefully maintained social and political structures. The arrival of this flood of settlers would mean, for these nations, a collision with a pressure that nothing in their previous experience had quite prepared them for. The mid-century decades brought the railroad into the national story, and with it, a transformation of the relationship between distance and time that was as significant in its way as any other development of the era. The first transcontinental railroad, completed in May of 1869, when a golden spike was driven into the ground at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, connecting the Union Pacific Railroad building westward from Omaha with the Central Pacific building eastward from Sacramento, collapsed the continent in a way that was almost difficult to comprehend. A journey that had taken 5 or 6 months by wagon could now be made in less than a week. The great distances that had shaped the psychology of westward migration, the sense of the West as something genuinely far away and genuinely difficult to reach, were compressed suddenly into something manageable. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was itself a slow, enormous undertaking, carried out over 6 years by tens of thousands of workers, a significant portion of them Chinese immigrants who had come to California during the gold rush, and found themselves channeled by circumstance and discrimination into the hardest and most dangerous labor the project required. They worked with hand tools and black powder through the Sierra Nevada mountains, drilling tunnels through solid granite with patient, methodical labor, lowering themselves in wicker baskets down sheer cliff faces to place explosive charges in holes they had drilled by hand, descending mile by mile through rock that had been forming itself since long before any human being had set foot on the continent. The Chinese workers were paid less than their Irish counterparts on the Union Pacific side, housed separately, fed differently, and largely written out of the celebratory accounts of the railroad's completion. Their contribution, immense and irreplaceable, settled quietly into the foundation of the thing they had built, invisible beneath the gleaming rails. The railroad changed not only transportation, but the entire pattern of settlement and economic development in the West, creating towns where there had been only open land, connecting distant markets to eastern financial centers, making possible the large-scale commercial agriculture that would transform the plains into the breadbasket of the nation. It also accelerated the final phase of the conflict between the expanding settler population and the indigenous nations of the West, making possible the rapid movement of troops and settlers into territories that had previously been too remote for sustained military pressure. The great bison herds of the plains, which had sustained the plains nations for millennia, and whose numbers had been estimated in the tens of millions at mid-century, were reduced by commercial hunting, enabled by the railroad, to near extinction by the 1880s, the bones of the slaughtered animals bleaching in long windrows across the flat grass, an absence so vast it amounted to a transformation of the landscape itself. The Plains nations, the Lakota and the Cheyenne and the Comanche and the Kiowa and many others, resisted the encroachments on their territories and the destruction of the resources on which their way of life depended with a determination and a tactical skill that made the decades between 1860 and 1890 a period of sustained, painful conflict across the Western Plains. The battles of this period, some of them defeats for the army and some of them victories, each one settling a little more weight onto the slow, grinding process of dispossession, moved across the landscape with the particular quality of a conflict that both sides understood on some level, could have only one ultimate outcome given the disparities of population and resources and the remorselessness of the forces driving the expansion. The final chapter of this long conflict is often marked by the events at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota in December of 1890, where soldiers of the 7th Cavalry opened fire on a group of Lakota men, women, and children in a confrontation that resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 250 and 300 people, many of them unarmed. The snow on the ground that day was cold and very still after it was over. The landscape held its silence, as it always does, as it had done through everything. The decades of the latter 19th century brought other transformations to the American landscape and the American economy, slower and less dramatic than the westward rush, but no less consequential in their accumulated effects. The Industrial Revolution, which had been developing in Britain since the latter decades of the 18th century, arrived in the United States with a gradual but ultimately overwhelming force, transforming the economy from one based primarily on agriculture and small-scale craft production into one centered increasingly on factories and mass production, and the concentrated power of industrial capital. The textile mills of New England, the iron foundries of Pennsylvania, the meatpacking plants of Chicago all grew through the middle decades of the century into something that earlier generations would barely have recognized: enormous operations employing thousands of workers, running on the power of steam and the logic of efficiency, producing goods in quantities that made the output of earlier eras seem almost quaint. The cities grew with this industrial transformation, drawing workers from the surrounding countryside and from an increasing stream of immigrants arriving from Europe, each wave of newcomers adding its own particular flavor to the complex mixture of American urban life. Irish immigrants, driven from their homeland by the catastrophic famine of the 1840s, settled in the industrial cities of the Northeast, their communities clustered in particular neighborhoods, their churches rising above the brick and cobblestone of the urban landscape. German immigrants settled across a broader geography, some in the cities and some on the rich farmland of the Midwest, bringing with them brewing traditions and musical culture, and a particular approach to community organization that left its mark on dozens of American towns and cities. Later in the century, Immigrants from southern and eastern Europe, from Italy and Poland and Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, arrived in numbers that transformed the character of the great industrial cities, their languages and foods and customs adding new layers to the already complex texture of American urban life. The decades following the Civil War, which we will take up more fully in the final chapter, were years of extraordinary economic expansion, the so-called Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to suggest the glittering surface of prosperity beneath which lay a great deal that was less admirable. The vast fortunes assembled by the industrialists of this era, the Rockefellers and Carnegies and Vanderbilts and Morgans, were built on the labor of workers whose wages and conditions were largely determined by the employers without meaningful countervailing power, and on the exploitation of natural resources, timber and coal and oil and iron, on a scale and at a speed that would have seemed almost incomprehensible to earlier generations. The landscape of the country at the end of the 19th century was visibly and profoundly different from what it had been at the beginning. The great eastern forests that had covered much of the continent when European settlers arrived had been reduced to fragments, the land cleared for farms and towns, and the insatiable appetite of the sawmill. The prairie grasslands were being broken by steel plows and planted with wheat and corn and oats, the deep root systems of the native grasses torn up and replaced with the shallow roots of annual crops, a transformation of the soil that would have consequences not yet imagined. The rivers ran differently than they had, diverted and dammed, and channeled for the needs of industry and agriculture. The air over the industrial cities was heavy with the smoke of coal, settling on the rooftops and the window ledges of row houses, and depositing itself in the lungs of the people who lived in them. And yet, for all the disruption and all the loss, there was also in these decades something that can only be called vitality, a rough, unruly, sometimes magnificent energy that was building things and connecting things and imagining things at a pace that left many observers breathless. The country was young in a way that countries only get to be young once, full of its own possibilities, not yet fully reckoning with the costs of what it was doing, moving forward with the particular momentum of a thing that has not yet encountered the limits of its own trajectory. The century closed with the country stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, 45 states admitted to the Union, the last remaining territories filling in with settlers, and beginning their own slow process of organization into statehood. The continent had been crossed and claimed and settled and transformed, its indigenous peoples reduced and confined, and their ways of life largely destroyed, its forests thinned and its rivers altered and its soil turned over and planted, its distances compressed by rails and wires into something manageable, its cities loud and smoky, and full of the sound of machinery, and the voices of people speaking dozens of languages in the crowded streets. The old landscape was still there, underneath it all. The rivers still moved in their ancient beds, carrying their patient loads of silt toward the sea. The mountains still stood in their places, cold and old and indifferent to the human activity at their feet. The sky was still enormous overhead, especially out on the open plains where the farms and the small towns sat in the flat distances like ships on a calm sea, their grain elevators rising above the horizon like the masts of something waiting for wind. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the lights came on in the farmhouse windows one by one, there was a quietness that settled over all of it, the particular end-of-day quietness of a landscape that has absorbed a great deal of human history, and is simply continuing, as landscapes do, to be itself. The century turned slowly, the way centuries do, without announcement, without fanfare. The last day of one becoming the first day of the next in the same unhurried sequence of hours and minutes that carries all things forward. The country that entered the 20th century was in many ways still becoming what it would eventually be, still working out the deepest implications of its own founding principles, still carrying within it the unresolved contradictions that the 19th century had deferred and compounded. The next chapter of its story was gathering itself in the quiet, patient way that all next chapters do, waiting for the moment when it would be ready to begin. There is a particular kind of mourning that belongs to the turning of a century, a mourning that feels, even in its ordinary details, like a threshold, like the first page of something that has not yet declared what it intends to be. The light comes in at the usual angle, the birds make their usual sounds, the air smells of the same mixture of earth and season that it always does at that particular time of year. And yet there is something in it, some quality of openness, of the not yet determined, that makes it feel different from the mornings that came before. The United States entered the 20th century with something of that quality about it, a nation still young enough to feel its own possibilities without yet knowing which of them would be realized, and which would dissolve quietly back into the territory of what might have been. The country that greeted the new century was a nation of approximately 76 million people, spread across a continental territory that stretched from the rocky coasts of Maine to the warm shores of the new state of California, from the northern forests of Minnesota to the subtropical wetlands of Florida. Its cities were growing with a speed that felt almost disorienting to those who were living through it. The skylines of New York and Chicago rising year by year with new buildings of steel and glass and stone that reached heights that previous generations would have found almost unimaginable. Its factories were producing goods in quantities that made it the largest industrial economy in the world. Its railroads had knit the vast geography of the continent into something connected and navigable, so that a person could travel from New York to San Francisco in a matter of days, watching the landscape change outside the train window from the dense forests of the east through the flat agricultural heartland to the arid spaces of the west, and finally the mountains and the coast. And yet the country carried within it, as it always had, the weight of its unresolved contradictions, the distance between its stated ideals and the lived reality of millions of its people. The decades that opened the 20th century were years in which some of those contradictions began, slowly and painfully and incompletely, to become more visible and more urgent, years in which new voices and new movements began to press against the structures of the existing order with the patient persistence of water against stone. The progressive era, as historians have come to call the decades between roughly 1900 and 1920, was a period of gradual reform, of a slow, broad reckoning with some of the consequences of the industrial expansion of the previous century. It was not a unified movement with a single agenda, but rather a loose gathering of overlapping concerns and energies, people troubled by different aspects of the same general condition, and pushing in different directions toward different remedies. There were journalists and writers, who came to be called muckrakers, who investigated and published detailed accounts of the conditions in the meatpacking plants of Chicago and the tenement neighborhoods of New York, and the political machines that ran the cities and the monopolistic practices of the great industrial corporations. Their work moved slowly through the reading public, each article and book adding another small weight to the growing sense that the existing arrangements required examination and adjustment. Theodore Roosevelt, who became president in September of 1901, following the death of President William McKinley at the hands of an anarchist in Buffalo, brought to the presidency an energy and a range of interests that were unusual even by the standards of the era. He was a man who spoke in complete paragraphs and thought in large categories, who cared simultaneously and with apparent genuine feeling about the regulation of industrial monopolies and the preservation of the natural landscape, about the rights of labor and the projection of American power abroad. His administration used the existing antitrust laws, which had been on the books since 1890, but only fitfully enforced, to bring legal actions against a number of the great industrial combinations, most notably the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company assembled by J.P. Morgan. The action was modest in its ultimate effects, but significant in what it suggested about the relationship between the federal government and the concentrated power of private capital, a relationship that had been largely deferential in the preceding decades, and was now, slowly and tentatively, asserting a different character. Roosevelt's commitment to the preservation of the natural landscape was perhaps the most enduring legacy of his presidency, an achievement whose value has only grown with the passage of time. He had a deep and genuine love of wild places, rooted in his own experience of the Western landscape, and the restorative effect it had had on him after the deaths of his mother and his first wife on the same day in February of 1884. Losses so sudden and so complete that he had fled westward to the Dakota Badlands, spending months on a cattle ranch in that austere and beautiful landscape, riding long days through the open country and sleeping under enormous skies, letting the space and the silence do their slow work on his grief. He emerged from that experience with a bond to the natural world that expressed itself, when he had the power to act on it, in the creation of 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 51 federal bird reservations, 4 national game preserves, 151 national forests, and the designation of over 230 million acres of land as protected in some form. These designations were made with the stroke of a pen, quickly enough, but they were the product of decades of slow, patient advocacy by a growing conservation movement, of which Roosevelt was the most powerful single member, but not the only important voice. The early decades of the century brought the United States into the broader currents of world affairs in ways that were gradual at first, and then, with the entry into the First World War in 1917, sudden and total. The war in Europe had been underway since the summer of 1914, drawing the major powers of the continent into a conflict of previously unimagined destructiveness, fought in the trenches of France and Belgium, and on the eastern plains of Russia, and in a dozen other theaters across a vast geography. The United States had watched from a distance, officially neutral, the debate between those who wanted to stay out entirely and those who felt the country had obligations or interests that would eventually require it to enter, playing out slowly in newspapers and Congress, and the conversations of ordinary people across the country. The decision to enter the war in April of 1917, following Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and the revelation of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States, was made by President Woodrow Wilson in a speech to Congress that framed American intervention in idealistic terms, as a war to make the world safe for democracy. Language that set expectations for the peace that followed the war that the peace itself would largely fail to meet. The American entry into the war, and the eventual arrival of fresh American troops in France in the summer and autumn of 1918, contributed to the Allied victory in November of that year. The armistice that ended the fighting was signed in a railway car in the forest of Campigny on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, and the guns fell silent across the landscape of France. And the silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that comes after a very long and very loud noise, enormous and almost incomprehensible to those who were present in it. The 1920s that followed were years of a particular kind of energy in the United States, the energy of relief and release after years of wartime constraint. A decade that pulsed with the new sounds of jazz music drifting from the open windows of nightclubs in Harlem and New Orleans and Chicago, with the new images of cinema flickering in darkened theaters in every city and small town, with the new mobility offered by the automobile, which was transforming not only transportation, but the physical landscape of the country, encouraging the spread of suburbs and the construction of roads, and the slow withdrawal from the walkable density of the older urban neighborhoods toward the dispersed, car-dependent patterns that would define American life for the rest of the century. It was also a decade of significant social anxiety, of the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan to membership numbers in the millions, of restrictive new immigration laws that reflected the anxious nativism of a portion of the population, of prohibition, the constitutional amendment that banned the manufacture and sale of alcohol, and which produced, in its unintended consequences, the flourishing of organized crime and the quiet persistence of the human desire for the things that have been forbidden. The African American community had been moving northward in the decades around the First World War in what historians call the Great Migration, a slow, determined movement of people from the rural South, where the system of Jim Crow segregation and the violence that enforced it made daily life a matter of constant navigation of humiliation and danger, toward the cities of the North, where conditions were better, imperfectly and incompletely better, but meaningfully so. Chicago and Detroit and New York and Philadelphia received hundreds of thousands of black Southerners, who found work in the factories and stockyards and service industries of the northern cities, and began to build communities of remarkable cultural vitality and political energy. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s was one expression of this vitality, a flowering of literature and music and visual art in the black neighborhood of Upper Manhattan that produced work of lasting beauty and significance. The voices of Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and Claude McKay, among many others, adding their particular music to the broader chorus of American cultural life, asserting with quiet but persistent force the full humanity and the creative richness of a community that the dominant society had long sought to diminish and ignore. The decade ended with a collapse so large and so sudden that it still reverberates in the national memory, felt in a physical way as an almost seismic event. The stock market crash of October 1929 was the most visible moment of a broader economic unraveling that had been developing beneath the surface of the decade's apparent prosperity, and it sent the American economy into a long, slow, grinding decline that lasted through most of the 1930s and came to be called the Great Depression. The unemployment rate rose gradually and then steeply, reaching 25% at its peak, a quarter of the working population without jobs, families losing their homes and their farms and their savings. The landscape of the country marked by the quiet, particular misery of people who had worked all their lives and found themselves with nothing. The Dust Bowl, which developed in the southern Great Plains through the early and middle 1930s, added an environmental dimension to the economic catastrophe, a slow-motion ecological disaster rooted in the decades of aggressive plowing of the prairie grasslands that had seemed so productive in the wet years, but had destroyed the soil's capacity to hold itself in place when the drought came, as droughts in that part of the country periodically and inevitably do. The topsoil of Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas and the surrounding states, built up over thousands of years of grass and rain, and the slow processes of biological decomposition, blew away in great dark clouds that blocked out the sun and deposited themselves hundreds of miles away, leaving behind a landscape of bare, drifted earth and abandoned farmhouses, and the slow, painful exodus of families who had lost everything. John Steinbeck's novel The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, captured the texture of this exodus in language of great simplicity and power, following one family's slow journey westward, along Route 66 to the uncertain promise of California, and it remains one of the most complete attempts to render in words what that particular time and that particular landscape felt like from the inside. Franklin Roosevelt's administration, which began in March of 1933, addressed the Depression through a broad and somewhat improvisational program of legislation and executive action called the New Deal, a collection of measures that created jobs through public works programs, regulated the financial system, established new protections for labor, and expanded the role of the federal government in the economic life of the country in ways that were genuinely unprecedented and genuinely controversial. The New Deal did not end the Depression, which persisted in various degrees through the remainder of the decade, but it prevented the worst possibilities, gave millions of people some form of relief, and in doing so perhaps preserved the faith in democratic institutions that might otherwise have eroded into something more dangerous. The social safety net programs created during this period, including Social Security, established a permanent floor of support for elderly and unemployed Americans that reshaped the relationship between citizens and their government in ways that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. The Second World War arrived for the United States not gradually, but in a single morning of sudden violence, on the 7th of December, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing over 2,000 Americans and drawing the country into a conflict that was already consuming most of the rest of the world. The attack ended the long, slow debate between interventionists and isolationists that had been playing out through the preceding years, pulling the country into the war with a unanimity of purpose that had been absent in the approach to the First World War. Within days, Germany and Italy had also declared war on the United States, and the country found itself engaged on two vast fronts simultaneously, in the Pacific and in Europe and North Africa, a commitment that required a mobilization of resources and human effort on a scale that the country had never previously attempted. The war transformed the American economy completely. The factories that had been idle or underutilized through the Depression years retooled and running at full capacity to produce the weapons and vehicles and supplies that the conflict required. Women entered the industrial workforce in large numbers, filling the positions left by men who had gone to serve in the military, their contribution embodied in the cultural image of Rossi the Riveter, the practical, capable, no-nonsense factory worker who became one of the defining images of the era. African American workers also moved into industrial jobs in large numbers, continuing and accelerating the Great Migration, their experience of fighting for democracy abroad while being denied it at home sharpening the consciousness of the civil rights struggle that would emerge in the post-war years. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, with Germany's surrender following the long, slow Allied advance from both West and East that had been grinding through the continent since the D-Day landings in Normandy in June of 1944. The war in the Pacific ended in August of 1945, following the use of atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August, weapons of a destructive power so unprecedented and so total that they changed not only the immediate military situation, but the entire framework within which human beings thought about war and its possibilities. The bombs fell in the morning, and the cities they fell on were simply gone, the particular texture of their streets and buildings and gardens, and the sounds of their daily life erased in a moment of heat and light so intense it left shadows burned into the stone of surviving walls. The decision to use these weapons, made by President Harry Truman, has been debated ever since with a seriousness and a weight that reflects the genuinely enormous moral stakes involved, arguments turning slowly around questions of necessity and proportion, and the value of the lives that were ended against the lives that might have been lost in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. The debate has never been fully resolved and perhaps never will be. The question's too large and too consequential to settle comfortably into any single answer. The post-war decades brought a particular kind of prosperity to the United States, an abundance that spread more broadly through the population than anything that had come before, carried on the long wave of economic expansion that followed the war. The GI Bill provided returning veterans with education benefits and low-interest mortgages that enabled millions of working-class families to send their children to college and buy homes in the new suburbs that were spreading across the edges of every American city, transforming farmland and woodland into neat grids of nearly identical houses with front lawns and attached garages, and the particular quietness of neighborhoods where everyone has more or less the same amount and is more or less at the same stage of life. The suburbs had a particular smell in those post-war years, the smell of new lumber and fresh paint and cut grass, and the faint chemical sweetness of new plastic, everything new and clean, and oriented toward the future in the way that things are when they have not yet had time to accumulate a past. The Cold War settled over this prosperity like a kind of permanent weather, a low-grade tension that persisted through the entire post-war period, shaping American foreign policy and domestic culture, and the daily consciousness of millions of people in ways both visible and invisible. The Soviet Union, which had emerged from the Second World War as the other great superpower, represented an ideological and geopolitical challenge that the United States addressed through a policy of containment, a strategy of preventing the further spread of Soviet influence through a combination of military alliances, foreign aid, and the maintenance of American military power in key regions around the world. The Korean War, from 1950 to 1953, was the first direct military expression of this containment policy. A conflict fought on the Korean peninsula that ended in an armistice, leaving the peninsula divided roughly where it had been when the war began, a conclusion that felt, to many Americans, unsatisfying in its inconclusiveness, but that reflected the new strategic reality of a world in which full-scale war between nuclear-armed powers was a prospect too terrible to contemplate. At home, the anxieties of the Cold War produced a period of political pressure and cultural conformity that made public life, for those who fell outside the approved boundaries of opinion and identity, a matter of careful navigation. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin lent his name to a period of aggressive investigation of alleged communist influence in American institutions, his accusations moving through the early 1950s with a speed and a destructiveness that ruined careers and reputations, and created a climate of fear and suspicion that settled over the country like a particular kind of winter, cold and gray and slow to lift. McCarthy was eventually discredited, his recklessness becoming visible enough to cost him his credibility, but the atmosphere he had helped to create persisted long after his own fall, changing only slowly and unevenly as the decade progressed. The civil rights movement, which had been building its foundations through the decades of the 1930s and 1940s, in the patient work of the NAACP and other organizations, emerged in the 1950s and 1960s as the most important moral and political movement in American life, pressing the country toward a reckoning with the distance between its stated ideals and the lived reality of its black citizens with a combination of legal strategy, nonviolent direct action, and the quiet, extraordinary courage of ordinary people willing to endure violence and imprisonment in the service of principles they understood to be both correct and urgent. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956, initiated by the quiet refusal of Rosa Parks to give up her seat to a white passenger on a city bus, and sustained for 381 days by the patient determination of the black community of Montgomery, Alabama, who walked and carpooled to work rather than ride a segregated system, was an early demonstration of the movement's capacity for sustained, disciplined collective action. Martin Luther King Jr., who emerged from the Montgomery boycott as the movement's most visible and eloquent leader, brought to the civil rights struggle a rhetorical gift and a philosophical grounding in the traditions of nonviolent resistance that gave the movement a particular character and a particular power. His speeches moved through their long, carefully constructed sentences with the patient, building quality of music, each phrase adding its weight to the one before, the meaning accumulating slowly until it arrived at something that felt, when you heard it, like a recognition rather than an argument, like something you had always known being said for the first time with the precision it deserved. The March on Washington in August of 1963, where King delivered the speech that contained his most famous passage, before an audience of hundreds of thousands of people gathered on the National Mall in the warm August afternoon, with the Lincoln Memorial at their backs and the reflecting pool stretching away before them, remains one of the most significant gatherings in American history, a moment when the country was asked, very publicly and very plainly, to look at itself and decide what it wanted to be. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 represented the legislative culmination of the movement's pressure, dismantling the legal architecture of segregation and restoring the voting rights that had been systematically denied to Black Americans across the South since the end of Reconstruction. These were not the end of the struggle, which continued and continues still, but they were genuine and significant achievements, hard-won through years of patient, dangerous, often lonely work by thousands of people whose names history has largely not preserved alongside the names of the famous leaders. They represented, however incompletely and imperfectly, a movement of the country closer to the ideals it had claimed from its founding, a slow bending of the arc that the Reverend King described, borrowing from the abolitionist Theodore Parker, as the long arc of the moral universe, bending slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward justice. The 1960s brought other upheavals alongside the civil rights movement, the decade accumulating a weight of change and loss and confusion that gave it a particular intensity in the national memory. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas on a warm November afternoon in 1963, a loss so sudden and so public, and so strange that it seemed to many Americans who lived through it to divide time into a before and an after, leaving a particular kind of grief that settled into the culture and persisted for years. The escalation of American involvement in Vietnam, which grew slowly through the early 1960s from a small advisory presence into a massive military commitment of more than 500,000 troops by 1968, a commitment that produced enormous casualties and no clear path to the victory that the strategy seemed to require, dividing the country between those who supported the war as a necessary part of the broader struggle against communist expansion, and those who saw it as a costly mistake or a moral wrong, and said so in protests that filled the streets of American cities with the particular sound and energy of public dissent. The late 1960s and early 1970s brought a gradual, painful withdrawal from Vietnam, the long, slow process of disengagement from a commitment that had proven impossible to fulfill, the last American troops leaving in 1973, and the South Vietnamese government falling to North Vietnamese forces in April of 1975, the final images of the American evacuation from Saigon. Helicopters lifting from rooftops while crowds pressed against the embassy walls below, carrying with them a particular weight of failure and loss that the country absorbed slowly and unevenly over the decades that followed. The environmental movement that gathered strength through the late 1960s and into the 1970s drew on a long tradition of American conservation thought going back through the century, finding new urgency in the visible deterioration of air and water quality in the industrial cities, in the publication of Rachel Carson's careful, patient, beautifully written book Silent Spring in 1962, which described the effects of pesticides on bird populations and ecosystems with a precision and a clarity that made the abstract visible and the distant immediate. The first Earth Day, celebrated on April 22, 1970, brought 20 million Americans into parks and streets and public spaces across the country in a quiet, broad demonstration of concern for the natural world. The National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act all passed in the early 1970s, establishing the framework of environmental regulation that would shape the relationship between industrial activity and the natural world for the remainder of the century. The final decades of the 20th century brought the country through a series of transitions that were each, in their own way, profound and gradual. The Reagan presidency of the 1980s marked a shift in the ideological center of gravity of American politics toward a greater skepticism about the role of government and a greater confidence in the market as the primary mechanism for allocating resources and generating prosperity. The Cold War that had defined American foreign policy for 4 decades came to its quiet end, not in a battle or a treaty, but in a slow crumbling of the Soviet system under the weight of its own contradictions, culminating in the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989 and the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. The wall came down in pieces, taken apart by jubilant crowds with hammers and bare hands, and the pieces were kept as souvenirs and displayed in museums, fragments of a division that had seemed permanent, and then, in the space of a few days, was simply gone. The technological revolution that had been developing through the latter decades of the century accelerated through the 1990s into something that transformed virtually every aspect of daily life with a speed that was genuinely disorienting. The Internet, developed initially as a military and academic communications network, became available to the general public in a usable form through the early 1990s, and by the end of the decade had become a fundamental infrastructure of commerce and communication and culture, connecting people and information in ways that collapsed distance and changed the texture of daily experience in ways still being worked out and understood. The world was getting smaller and faster and more connected, the particular solitude of distance that had shaped so much of American history dissolving into something new and not yet fully named. The new century arrived with its own particular set of challenges and transformations, its first morning already gathering the weight of what would follow. The attacks of September 11, 2001, when 4 commercial aircraft were hijacked and used as weapons, 2 of them destroying the towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, one damaging the Pentagon outside Washington, and one crashing into a field in Pennsylvania after its passengers attempted to overwhelm the hijackers, constituted a loss of nearly 3,000 lives in a single morning, and a trauma to the national consciousness that reoriented American foreign policy for the years that followed. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that were the most direct expression of that reorientation lasted far longer and cost far more, in lives and resources and moral clarity, than their architects had anticipated, each passing year adding its weight to the slow, difficult reckoning with what they had and had not accomplished. The financial crisis of 2008, the most severe economic disruption since the Great Depression, sent another tremor through the foundations of the country's prosperity. The collapse of a housing bubble inflated by years of risky lending and inadequate regulation spreading through the financial system with a quiet and then sudden destructiveness that cost millions of Americans their homes and their savings and their jobs, and required a government response of enormous scale to prevent a complete collapse of the financial system. The recovery that followed was gradual, uneven, leaving behind it a landscape of increased inequality and diminished trust in institutions that shaped the political atmosphere of the decade that followed. The long struggle for civil rights expanded through these decades in new directions, the movement for marriage equality gathering force through the 1990s and 2000s, and reaching its legal culmination in the Supreme Court's Obergefell v. Hodges decision in 2015, which recognized the right of same-sex couples to marry in all 50 states. the decision arriving after years of gradual shift in public opinion and a series of state-level changes that had been moving in this direction for more than a decade. The movement for racial justice, which had never ceased its work since the civil rights era, reasserted itself with new urgency in the second decade of the new century. The deaths of Black Americans at the hands of police officers and the public attention drawn to these deaths by video documentation and social media circulation, generating a renewed national conversation about the structures of inequality that persisted, quietly and stubbornly, beneath the legal gains of the 1960s. The election of Barack Obama to the presidency in November of 2008, the first African American to hold the office, was an event of unmistakable historical significance, carrying within it the weight of the entire history that had been described through these 5 chapters. All the long distance between the world of the first enslaved Africans brought to Virginia in 1619 and this particular November evening when a tall, quiet man from Chicago stood before an enormous crowd in Grant Park and spoke of change and hope in a voice that was measured and clear and careful not to overstate what a single election could accomplish. It was not an ending or a resolution. It was a moment, a particular quality of light on a particular evening, the crowd's breath visible in the cool autumn air, the faces turned upward with an expression that was complicated and moving and very human, a mixture of joy and relief and the quiet knowledge that the work was not finished, had never been finished, was the kind of work that is never finished because it is the work of becoming, the slow, imperfect, never fully completed project of a nation trying to make itself into what it has always claimed to be. The United States that moves through the early decades of the 21st century is still, in many of its deepest characteristics, the same nation that was slowly taking shape in the pages of all these preceding chapters. It is still a nation of enormous geographical variety, from the cold, rocky coasts of the Northeast to the warm Gulf Shore, from the flat agricultural heartland to the mountains and deserts of the West, from the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest to the subtropical tangle of the Florida Everglades. It is still a nation of remarkable cultural diversity, its cities filled with the languages and foods and music and traditions of peoples from every part of the world, the mixture producing something that is continuously evolving, never fixed, always becoming. It is still a nation in conversation with its own founding ideals, measuring itself against the distance between what it claims to be and what it is, the tension between the two driving the gradual, imperfect, ongoing process of change. The land itself endures beneath all of this, patient and ancient and largely indifferent to the human dramas that have unfolded upon it. The Mississippi River still moves toward the Gulf of Mexico, brown and wide and unhurried, carrying its load of silt and memory. The Rocky Mountains still stand against the western sky, their highest peaks white with snow in every season, the light on them changing slowly through the day from the pale gold of morning to the warm ochre of late afternoon to the cool blue of evening. The Great Plains stretch on in every direction, the grass bending in the wind, the sky enormous overhead, the distances so vast they seem to breathe. The old forests of the East, much reduced from what they were but not entirely gone, still hold their particular darkness in summer, the light filtering down through the leaves in shifting, dappled patterns, the air cool and smelling of earth and bark and the particular, ancient smell of growing things. And in the cities and the towns and the farmhouses scattered across this vast and varied landscape, People are going about the quiet business of their lives, working and resting and raising children and growing old, carrying within them the long accumulated weight of everything that has come before, the memories and the stories and the patterns of thought and feeling that have been shaped by all of the history described in these 5 gentle chapters. Most of them are not thinking about history as they go about their days. They are thinking about what is immediately before them, the particular texture of the present moment, the smell of coffee in the morning, and the sound of rain on the roof at night, and the faces of the people they love and the small, manageable details of a single day lived in the only time any of us ever actually inhabit, which is now, which is always now, which is the only moment in which any story is ever truly told. The night settles softly over the continent, moving from east to west with the slow turning of the earth, the lights coming on one by one in the windows of houses from Maine to California, from Minnesota to Texas, each window a small warm square of light in the dark, each one containing a life in progress, a story still unfolding. The rivers move in their beds. The mountains hold their cold silence. The plains breathe in the dark. The old land continues its ancient, patient processes, indifferent and enduring and vast. And over all of it, the stars come out, the same stars that looked down on the first people crossing the ancient land bridge from Asia, on the Norse seafarers in their long boats, on the colonial farmers in their fields, on the wagon trains moving slowly across the prairie, on all of the living and the dying and the building and the losing that has made this place what it is, and what it is still becoming, slowly, gently, one quiet day at a time. In the unhurried and patient way that all true things become themselves, like light spreading across a wide landscape at dawn, like water finding its way to the sea, like the long, slow arc of time bending, always and forever, toward the morning,